In the frost-laden Adirondack Mountains, a professional photographer was about to document abandoned structures. What started as a routine expedition photographing forgotten buildings took a shocking turn when he came face to face with a cabin's window, initiating a glimpse into the impossible. Joel Winters wasn't your typical nature photographer. For 15 years, he had spent his life capturing abandoned places and forgotten histories, known for his technical precision and ability to find stories in decay. When he encountered the pristine cabin standing impossibly maintained in the wilderness, he had no idea he was stepping into a temporal nexus that would challenge everything he understood about reality. Joel raised his camera to that frost-covered window, a simple action that would lead to him becoming entangled in a decades-old mystery involving his own grandfather's disappearance. What began as a photography assignment would become a journey into the very fabric of time itself. The Adirondack community would never be the same after the truth about the Sullivan family's eternal dinner and the empty chair that waited through decades was finally revealed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first frost of autumn had come early to the Adirondacks, leaving the world crystalline and strange in the late afternoon light. Joel Winters adjusted his camera's aperture, capturing the way ice crystals caught the sun along a rusted chain, dangling from an abandoned lumber mill's doorway. The image would fit perfectly in his ongoing series documenting the region's forgotten structures, a testament to humanity's tenuous hold on the wilderness. He checked the photograph's histogram on his camera's LCD screen, ensuring he'd captured the full range of shadows and highlights. Technical precision was his trademark, the reason museums and galleries sought out his work. Every photograph told a story, but only if you knew how to read the details. The trail behind the mill had grown over, barely visible beneath decades of fallen leaves. Joel consulted his topographical map, frowning. The path didn't appear on any of his reference materials, but something about its trajectory intrigued him. He'd learned to trust these instincts over 15 years of wilderness photography. The forest grew denser as he followed the unmapped trail, his boots crunching through the frost-covered leaves. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, though the sun still hung above the tree line. Joel paused to photograph a grandfather, birch, its bark peeling away like pages from an ancient book when he first glimpsed the cabin through the trees. Something about it stopped him cold. Unlike the other structures he'd documented that day, this cabin showed no signs of decay. Its log walls stood straight and true, the roof intact, windows unbroken. It looked maintained. Yet there were no tire tracks, no footprints, no signs of human presence despite the fresh frost coating everything else in sight. Joel approached slowly, camera raised. Through the viewfinder, he noticed other inconsistencies. The cabin's construction style was distinctly older than the surrounding abandoned buildings. 1950s, maybe early 1960s by the architectural details. But the wood looked newly hewn, the chinking between logs fresh and clean. The light was failing, faster now. The forest growing darker while a warm glow emanated from the cabin's front window. Joel lowered his camera, frowning. There was no electricity out here, no power lines for miles. He moved closer to the window, drawn by the light and movement within. The frost coating the glass created a dreamlike effect, but he could clearly see a family gathered around a dinner table, a mother serving what looked like pot roast, a father in a cardigan sweater, two children, a boy and girl, seated across from each other, the girl reaching for a basket of rolls. Joel's photographer's eye cataloged the details automatically. The mother's bouffant hairdo, the father's narrow-lapelled suit jacket hanging by the door, the children's clothes, the boy in a crew cut and sweater vest, the girl with a ribbon in her hair and Peter Pan collar. And on the wall, a calendar featuring a streaming American flag. October, 1962. Joel blinked hard, but the scene remained. As he watched, the mother laughed at something the father said, serving another portion of roast. The boy reached for his milk glass while the girl buttered a roll. Then the mother laughed again. The same laugh, the same serving motion. The boy reached for his glass. The girl buttered her roll. The scene reset, playing out again exactly as before. Joel's breath caught in his throat. He fumbled with his camera, raising it to the window. Through the viewfinder, the family continued their endless loop, unaware of his presence or the gathering darkness outside. Each cycle lasted perhaps 3 minutes before beginning again, every gesture and expression precisely repeated. But it was the empty chair that finally broke through his professional detachment. A single vacant place at the table, set with plate and silverware, waiting for someone who never arrived to fill it. Something about that empty chair tugged at his memory. A photograph he'd seen in his grandmother's house, a family dinner much like this one with one person missing. His grandfather, Thomas Winters, who had vanished in these very woods in the autumn of 1962, leaving behind a wife, a young son, and a collection of mysterious photographs that had inspired Joel's own career choice. The scene reset again. The mother laughed. The father spoke. The boy reached for his glass while his sister buttered her roll, and the empty chair waited, patient as the grave, while the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the Adirondacks. Joel's hands trembled slightly as he connected his camera to his laptop, the familiar ritual of downloading images doing little to calm his racing thoughts. His grandmother's house was quiet save for the tick of an ancient wall clock and the soft whir of his external hard drive. Through the kitchen window, he could see frost-forming patterns on the glass, reminding him too much of that cabin window and what he'd witnessed behind it. The first images from his day's shoot appeared. On screen, the abandoned lumber mill, the frost-covered chain, the grandfather birch. Each one technically perfect, telling its intended story of abandonment and nature's slow reclamation. Then came the cabin photos. Nothing. He scrolled through again. The cabin photos were missing, though he distinctly remembered taking them. Where there should have been images of the mysterious structure, he found only blank frames, as if the camera's sensor had captured nothing but darkness. "You're up late," Joel startled at his grandmother's voice. Claire Winters stood in the kitchen doorway, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, wearing the same faded blue robe she'd had for as long as he could remember. She moved to the coffee maker with practiced efficiency, despite the late hour. "Found something interesting today," Joel said carefully, watching her reaction. "A cabin way out past the old lumber mill." The coffee scoop paused fractionally in its journey from can to filter. "There's nothing out there anymore," Claire said, her voice steady but holding something beneath its surface. "Just ruins and old foundations." This cabin was intact, perfect condition actually. Joel opened his laptop's photo management software. "I took pictures, but they're not showing up for some reason." Claire's back remained turned as she filled the coffee maker with water. "Equipment malfunction?" "Maybe." Joel stood, moving to the boxes of old family photos he'd been digitizing between shooting sessions. "Thing is, something about that cabin seemed familiar. Like I'd seen it before." He withdrew a particular album, one he'd been avoiding. The spine was cracked leather, the pages yellowed with age. Claire's hand stilled on the coffee maker as he opened it. "Those are very old," she said softly. "Your grandfather's photographs." "That's right." Joel turned pages slowly, scanning the black and white images. Thomas Winters had been an accomplished photographer himself, though his work had focused more on local families and events. Page after page showed community, gatherings, church picnics, holiday celebrations. He stopped. There it was. The photograph showed a cabin, shot from almost the exact angle Joel had attempted earlier that day. A family stood out front, mother, father, 2 children. The caption, written in his grandfather's precise hand, read, "Sullivan family, new home, October 1962. "Graham," Joel said carefully, "do you remember the Sullivans?" The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. Claire didn't answer immediately, her hands gripping the counter's edge. When she finally turned, her face held the careful neutrality Joel recognized from childhood conversations about his grandfather. "Why are you asking about them?" "Because I saw them today." He held up the photograph. "In this cabin, Having dinner, only... He hesitated, knowing how it would sound. Only they were stuck somehow. Like a video loop, replaying the same few minutes over and over. Claire's face drained of color. She sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, her usual grace deserting her. You shouldn't have gone out there. You know about the cabin? About what's happening there? I know you need to leave it alone. Her voice held an edge of desperation he'd never heard before. Some questions don't need answers, Joel. Some doors shouldn't be opened. He returned to the album, turning pages with growing urgency until he found what he was looking for. Another photograph, this one of a dinner scene through a window. The same family, the same table setting. And there, in the corner of the frame, an empty chair. This was his last photograph, wasn't it? The night he disappeared? Claire's hands shook as she poured coffee into 2 mugs. Your grandfather was investigating something. Local stories about lights in the woods, people seeing things that couldn't be explained. The Sullivans were part of it somehow. She pushed a mug toward him. Then they vanished, all of them overnight. And Thomas. Her voice caught. Thomas went looking for answers. Joel pulled a yellowed newspaper clipping from between the album's pages. The headline read, "Fourth Disappearance. Rocks Adirondack Community." Below it, a smaller subtitle, "Local photographer Thomas Winter's latest to vanish in mountain mystery." A name in the article's 3rd paragraph caught his eye. Margaret Chen, local folklore researcher, suggests possible connections to similar incidents in the region's history. Margaret still lives here, Claire said quietly, reading his expression. Still keeps her records at the Historical Society. She reached across the table, her fingers cold as they gripped his wrist. But Joel, please, don't go down this path. I've already lost Thomas to that place. I can't lose you too. The tears go both ways, Mr. Winters. Every door that opens into the past also opens from the past into the present. And sometimes what comes through isn't what you expect. Joel turned another page in his grandfather's journal, and a loose paper fluttered to the floor. He reached for it, recognizing the careful handwriting of a child. The paper was torn, showing only a fragment of what appeared to be a diary entry. Daddy says we have to be careful about the lights. Says they're getting stronger. Mommy doesn't like talking about them, but I can see them all the time now, even in daylight. They're so pretty, like Christmas lights underwater. The empty chair at dinner is for... The entry ended there, the paper torn mid-sentence. Diana Sullivan's diary, Margaret explained. The only piece ever found. She was 12 when they vanished. My grandfather, Joel said slowly. He was trying to help them, wasn't he? Margaret began returning photographs to their folders, with methodical precision. Thomas recognized something in that family situation, something he thought he could document, maybe even prevent. She closed the filing cabinet with a decisive click. But some things don't want to be prevented, Mr. Winters. Some patterns must play out, no matter how many times we try to change them. She moved to one of the maps on her wall, tracing a line with her finger. That cabin exists in what we call a temporal eddy, a place where time loops back on itself, creating patterns that repeat and repeat until... She turned back to him, her expression grave. Until someone breaks the cycle. But breaking cycles has consequences, the kind that ripple backward and forward through time. Joel thought of the family and their endless dinner scene, the empty chair waiting like an unspoken question. I need to go back, he said. I need to understand what happened to them, to him. The doors swing both ways, Margaret warned again, her voice heavy with meanings Joel couldn't quite grasp. If you open one wide enough to step through, you have no guarantee about what might step back through with you. Outside her office windows, the afternoon light was fading, the mountains casting long shadows across the valley. And somewhere in those shadows, Joel knew, an impossible cabin waited with its frost-covered windows and its endless loop of unfinished dinner, while an empty chair held its patient vigil for someone who was already there, watching through the glass. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows through the trees as Joel set up his tripod. each metallic click of extending legs echoing in the strange stillness around the cabin. He'd brought every piece of equipment he owned: digital cameras, his grandfather's old Leica, even a Super 8 camera he sometimes used for light studies. If there was a way to document what was happening here, he would find it. Margaret's warnings echoed in his mind as he worked, but professional habit drove him forward. He'd arranged his cameras in a semicircle, each set to capture a different aspect of the phenomenon: infrared, long exposure, high-speed sequential shooting. The technical problems gave him something concrete to focus on, a buffer against the impossibility of what he was attempting to record. The first sign that something was different came when he checked his light meter. The readings made no sense, showing brilliant daylight values despite the gathering dusk. He looked up from the device to find patches of luminescence drifting through the trees like underwater stars, exactly as Diana had described in her diary fragment. Inside the cabin, the eternal dinner scene continued its loop, but something had changed. The cycles seemed shorter now, more erratic. Joel documented each iteration, noting variations in his notebook. He was reviewing his notes when movement caught his eye. Diana, the young girl, had turned her head mid-loop, not toward her brother as she always did, but toward the window, toward him. Joel's breath caught, her eyes, bright and intelligent, fixed directly on his. The rest of the family continued their endless routine, but Diana remained still, watching him with an expression that seemed far too knowing for a 12-year-old girl. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear through the glass. Joel fumbled with his cameras, but each viewfinder showed only static or darkness where Diana should be. He stepped closer to the window, straining to understand what she was trying to say. The air around him changed, becoming thick and resistant, like moving through deep water. The floating lights multiplied, their glow intensifying until they rivaled the setting sun. And still Diana watched him, her face a mixture of warning and invitation. A flash of movement near the cabin's back door caught his attention. Joel circled the structure carefully, his boots crunching on frost that shouldn't have been there in the relatively warm evening air. The door hung slightly ajar. He was certain it had been closed before, revealing a sliver of interior that seemed to shift between past and present with each blink. Something gleamed on the door's surface. Joel leaned closer, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate what appeared to be words scratched into the wood. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood pale against the weathered surface. Claire knows the way through. Ask about the night she followed. The handwriting was childish but deliberate, each letter carved with careful precision. Joel touched the marks, finding them warm despite the surrounding frost. As his fingers traced the words, a child's voice echoed from somewhere just behind him. "You have his eyes." Joel spun around, but the space behind him was empty save for the drifting lights. When he turned back to the door, the scratched message had vanished, leaving only smooth, weathered wood. Inside the cabin, the loop continued, but now he noticed other changes. Items moved between cycles, a book changing position on a shelf, a coat sliding fractionally along its hook, and the empty chair. Had it always been angled that way, as if someone had just pushed back from the table? His grandfather's Leica, hanging unused around his neck, suddenly grew warm. Joel raised it to his eye more by instinct than decision. Through its viewfinder, the scene transformed. The cabin's interior appeared with perfect clarity, but now he could see traces of movement overlaid on the dinner scene. Shadow figures moving through the space, including one that seemed to pause and watch him through the camera's lens. The last photo Thomas Winters had ever taken was through this same camera, possibly from this exact spot. Joel lowered the Leica with trembling hands. His other cameras continued their automated shooting sequences, their soft clicks marking time, like mechanical heartbeats. But he knew already what he would find when he reviewed their footage: nothing but darkness and static, while the Leica held the only true record of what he'd witnessed. As if responding to this realization, the floating lights began to fade. The dinner scene resumed its regular rhythm, Diana once again turning to her brother right on cue. But as Joel packed up his equipment in the growing darkness, He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching him, still waiting to see what he would do with her message about his grandmother. He left his tripod marking the spot, planning to return at first light. But as he walked away, he heard it topple behind him with a metallic clang. When he turned back, the tripod stood exactly as he'd left it, each leg planted firmly in soil that now bore the clear imprint of two sets of footprints, his own leading away, and another smaller set leading toward the cabin's back door. Dawn light filtered through Claire's kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the breakfast table that reminded Joel too much of the cabin's eternal dinner scene. His grandmother moved between stove and table with practiced efficiency, laying out plates of eggs and toast. The routine so familiar it seemed to exist in its own kind of loop. "Diana Sullivan sent me a message," Joel said quietly, watching his grandmother's back stiffen as she poured coffee. She carved it into the cabin's door. "About you." The coffee pot wavered, dark liquid splashing onto the counter. Claire set it down with deliberate care, her other hand gripping the edge of the sink. "That's impossible." "Claire knows the way through," Joel quoted. "Ask about the night she followed." "What night was that, Gram?" Claire turned slowly, her face pale in the strengthening sunlight. For a moment, she looked like the young woman in his grandfather's photographs, the same stubborn set to her, jaw the same haunted eyes. "You don't understand what you're asking." "Then help me understand." Joel gestured to the table, to the plates she'd set out. "3 places, Gram. You always set 3 places at breakfast, even though it's just been you and me since Dad died. Why?" Claire sank into her chair, her movements suddenly fragile. "Because habits protect us. Routines keep the walls strong." She touched the empty place setting with trembling fingers. Thomas understood that at the end. How patterns can become anchors when reality starts to drift. She rose abruptly, disappearing into the pantry. Joel heard scraping sounds, then she returned with a dusty cardboard box. "I should have burned these years ago, but I couldn't let him be forgotten completely." Inside the box, Joel found notebooks, loose photographs, and strips of negatives carefully stored in protective sleeves. His grandfather's research materials, preserved exactly as he'd left them. Claire withdrew a particular photograph, handling it like it might crumble to dust. "Sarah Sullivan was my best friend," she said softly. "We grew up together, shared everything. When the lights started appearing in the woods, her daughter Diana was the first to see them. Such a peculiar child, always seeing things others missed." Claire's voice caught. "Sarah confided in me, told me about the strange things happening in their house, the way time seemed to slip sometimes, items moving on their own, voices in empty rooms." Joel spread the materials across the table, creating a timeline of photographs and journal entries. And Thomas tried to help them? He thought he could document it, prove what was happening. He and Robert Sullivan, Diana's father, they had theories about astronomical alignments, about places where the fabric between times wore thin. Claire's hands shook as she sorted through the photographs. Then Diana started talking about doors, ways through, said she could see them, like windows opening between moments. She found what she was looking for, a photograph showing 2 families at a picnic, the Sullivans and the Winters, gathered around a checkered blanket. Joel recognized his grandfather, behind the camera's tripod. Claire stood next to Sarah Sullivan, both women laughing at some forgotten joke. And there was Diana, staring directly at the camera with that same knowing expression he'd seen through the cabin window. "The night they disappeared," Claire continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I followed Thomas into the woods. He'd been tracking the lights, convinced they were building towards something. Said the astronomical alignment was perfect. Something about stellar positions matching patterns from local legends." She pushed aside her untouched breakfast, spreading out a star chart covered in Thomas's annotations. "I found him at the cabin. He was half in and half out somehow, like a photograph double exposed. He saw me, tried to warn me back, but his voice..." She pressed her hands against her eyes. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. What happened then? Joel asked gently. I ran. The words came out like they'd been torn from her. I ran, and when I came back with help the next morning, they were all gone. The Sullivans, Thomas, everything. Even the cabin had vanished. She met Joel's eyes. Until now. Until you found it. Joel studied the star chart, noting the carefully plotted positions and dates. His grandfather's final notes indicated a recurring cycle, a pattern of astronomical alignments that created what he called temporal thin points. The next alignment, Joel said slowly. It's this week, isn't it? That's why the cabin has reappeared. Why Diana can reach through. Claire grabbed his hand with surprising strength. You can't go back there. The alignment doesn't just open doors, Joel. It tears them off their hinges. Thomas knew that at the end. Knew he'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. But you've kept watching. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Joel said, realization dawning. The 3-place settings, the preserved photos, the star charts. You've been tracking the cycles all these years, waiting for another chance. Waiting, Claire acknowledged, and dreading. Because Diana was right, I do know the way through. I saw it that night, saw how the doors work, but knowing the way and daring to take it. She stood, moving to a drawer Joel had never seen her open. From it, she withdrew a small leather notebook, its pages warped and stained. Thomas wasn't the only one keeping records, she said. And Sarah wasn't the only one who knew what her child could do. She placed the notebook in front of Joel. If you're determined to follow this path, you need to understand what really happened in 1962, what Diana was trying to prevent, and why that empty chair isn't just waiting for someone to fill it. She touched the star chart one last time, her finger tracing a particular constellation. It's waiting for someone to complete the circle. Joel spread Claire's leather notebook across his grandfather's astronomical charts, the 2 records of 1962 creating a strange palimpsest on the kitchen table. His grandmother had finally gone to bed, leaving him alone with the weight of decades-old secrets. The diary's pages were brittle with age, covered in a child's careful cursive that gradually became more erratic as the entries progressed. September 15, 1962. Mom says I shouldn't write about the lights anymore, but I don't know what else to write about. They're everywhere now. Like Christmas decorations underwater, just like I told Mr. Winters. He believes me. He sees them too, even if his camera can't catch them right. Dad says we're all just tired, that the move to the new cabin is making us imagine things. But he's wrong. The cabin chose us, not the other way around. Joel checked the date against his grandfather's notes. Thomas had documented his first significant light phenomenon that same evening, describing it as aurora-like manifestations, but localized and seemingly responsive to observation. September 23, 1962, had dinner with the Winters family tonight. Claire made pot roast my favorite. She watches me sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking. I think she knows I can see more than I'm supposed to. Tommy played with my brother while the adults talked about boring things, but I stayed quiet and listened. Dad and Mr. Winters kept mentioning the star alignment, how it's almost time for something. Mom got mad when they brought up the old stories about people disappearing. P.S. The watching place showed me something new today. If you stand in exactly the right spot behind the old birch tree, you can see straight through to different times, like looking through layers of glass. I saw myself having dinner over and over, but something was wrong with the picture. In the margin beside this entry, Diana had drawn a series of interconnected circles, each containing what looked like astronomical symbols. Joel compared them to his grandfather's charts. They matched perfectly, though Diana's drawings predated Thomas's calculations by several weeks. October 1st, 1962, Mom and Dad fought again. About the chairs this time. Dad keeps counting them, over and over, saying there's one too many. But he's counting wrong. We need that extra chair. It's for later, for when the door opens properly. Mr. Winters understands. He's been photographing the chair from different angles trying to catch what I see. But you can't capture it with cameras. You have to use different eyes. The lights are getting stronger. They pulse in time with the stars now. Claire saw them too when she visited yesterday. She got very quiet and made Mom cry by asking about old stories, about other families who found doors in the woods. Mom says we're not supposed to talk about those stories anymore. Joel found a loose page tucked between entries, covered in what appeared to be random numbers. But when he overlaid it on one of Thomas's star charts, the numbers aligned perfectly with particular stellar coordinates. Diana had been mapping the same patterns his grandfather tracked, but through some intuitive understanding rather than scientific calculation. October 8, 1962, I found the watching place again today. It's easier to reach now. Just follow the lights between the birch trees until the air gets thick like honey. If you stand very still and don't breathe too loud, you can hear voices from different times all talking at once. Mr. Winters was there too, but not the normal him. The him from another time watching through his camera. He didn't see me watching him watch us. Mom says we have to be careful now. The alignment is almost perfect, and the door wants to open all the way. Dad keeps talking about proof and documentation, but he doesn't understand. The door doesn't want to be documented, it wants to be used. The next entry was dated October 12th, the day before the disappearances. Diana's usually neat handwriting had become almost frantic. The chair knows. It's always known. That's why it's there, waiting. Not empty, really. Just empty in this time. Mr. Winters is getting too close to understanding. I see him through the window sometimes, but not from inside looking out. From outside looking in, even when I'm sitting at the table. How can I be in both places? Mom says time isn't supposed to fold like this, but it does. It folds and folds until all the creases line up and you can step through from one side to the other. Claire saw me today. The real me, not the me that's stuck in the loop. I tried to warn her about the door, about what happens when you take pictures of something that doesn't want to be seen. But time was slippery and the words came out backwards. P.S. If you're reading this later, you will be. Check the birch grove where the 3 trees make a triangle. Count 7 steps from the center toward the North Star. That's where the watching place is strongest, but don't bring cameras. Cameras make the door angry. They try to pin down what needs to stay fluid. P.P.S. The empty chair isn't for who they think it's for. It's for. The entry ended abruptly, the pen stroke trailing off into a shaky line. The remaining pages were blank, save for one final note. In the margin of the last page, written in a different hand, one Joel recognized as his grandfather's. Diana's right about the door. It goes both ways, but what she doesn't understand is that someone has to close it from both sides. The chair isn't waiting for an arrival. It's waiting for a departure. Joel checked the astronomical charts one final time, comparing them to current star positions. The alignment his grandfather and Diana had tracked would repeat in exactly 3 days. And there, marked on his grandfather's final map, was a triangle of birch trees with a notation about magnetic north. He knew where he had to go next. The watching place was waiting for him, just as it had waited for Thomas 60 years ago, just as Diana had known it would. Pre-dawn light filtered through the autumn canopy as Joel checked his equipment one final time. He'd brought both digital and analog cameras, his grandfather's Leica, and a Polaroid SX-70, the same model Thomas had carried on his final expedition. Diana's diary lay open in his pack, along with his grandfather's star charts and a modern GPS unit that had already started displaying impossible coordinates. The woods felt different this morning. The usual forest sounds, birdsong, rustling, leaves, distant streams, seemed to echo from slightly wrong directions, as if the acoustic space itself had begun to fold. Joel oriented himself using Thomas's last mapped position, looking for the triangle of birch trees Diana had described. The first trail marker appeared exactly where his grandfather's notes indicated, a series of nested triangles carved into a lightning-struck oak. But the cuts looked fresh, the exposed wood pale and clean, despite being documented in photographs from 1962. Joel photographed the marker with each camera, watching through the viewfinders as the wood seemed to age and weather between frames. 7 steps from the center toward the North Star, Joel muttered, consulting Diana's instructions. But which center? The birch grove remained elusive, hidden behind normal-looking trees that somehow never yielded to the formation he sought. His GPS unit spun in useless circles, each reading contradicting the last. The first real anomaly appeared mid-morning, a campsite that flickered between states of age with each blink. One moment, Joel saw fresh ashes in a stone-ringed fire pit, a modern camping chair folded nearby. The next, the stones had scattered and grown moss, while a canvas tent from another era sagged between trees. He photographed each configuration, but the digital cameras captured only static. The Polaroids, however, showed both states superimposed, like double exposures that moved when you tilted the print. By noon, the woods had become openly hostile to documentation. Batteries drained in seconds, memory cards corrupted. Only the mechanical cameras still functioned, though the images they captured increasingly diverged from what Joel observed. Through the Leica's viewfinder, he saw people moving between the trees. Figures dressed in clothes from different decades, all walking the same paths but never meeting. The lights began appearing as the day waned, just as Diana had described them, like Christmas decorations underwater. They drifted between trees in complex patterns that reminded Joel of star charts. He followed their movement, letting them guide him deeper into the increasingly fluid space of the forest. A child's laughter echoed from somewhere ahead. Joel pushed through a stand of evergreens and found himself in a small clearing he'd somehow circled back to 3 times already. But now, half buried in the leaves, lay a stuffed rabbit, its fabric cycling between fresh and weathered as he watched. He recognized it from one of the Sullivan family photographs, Diana's constant companion during their documented year at the cabin. When he reached for the toy, his hand passed through several versions of it before finding purchase. The rabbit felt real enough in his grasp, but the Polaroid he took showed it floating several inches above the forest floor, occupying multiple positions simultaneously. The discovery seemed to trigger something in the woods around him. The lights intensified and the air took on the thick, honey-like quality Diana had mentioned. Joel's next step landed somewhere slightly offset from where his foot should have been, and suddenly the forest transformed. He stood in the same space but observed from multiple temporal angles, like a cubist painting come to life. Through this fractured lens, he finally spotted the birch grove. 3 massive trees formed a perfect triangle, their bark peeling away to reveal what looked like writing beneath, not carved into the wood but emerging from within it. Joel raised the Leica with trembling hands, knowing even as he did that his grandfather must have performed this same action 60 years ago. The resulting photographs developed later in Margaret's darkroom would show something impossible. Joel himself standing in the grove, photographing another version of himself, who photographed another version, stretching back through decades of iterations, and in each version, the same stuffed rabbit sat at his feet, while a young girl watched from just outside the frame, her face both 12 and ancient. But in the moment, Joel only knew that his professional detachment had finally shattered. The woods had become a living thing around him, breathing with the same temporal rhythm that pulsed through Diana's diary entries. He understood now why his grandfather's notes had grown increasingly frantic. How do you maintain scientific objectivity when reality itself begins to fold? As if in answer to this thought, every piece of electronic equipment he carried died simultaneously. In the sudden silence, Joel heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions at once. The lights swirled closer, forming patterns that matched the astronomical diagrams in Thomas's charts. And there, just ahead, 3 birch trees waited in perfect triangulation. Joel took 7 steps from their center, pointing toward a north star that somehow appeared in the afternoon sky. The honey-thick air wrapped around him as he raised the Leica one final time, its mechanical heart beating in sync with the pulsing lights. Through its viewfinder, he saw what his grandfather must have seen, the watching place where all times met and merged. The Polaroids he managed to take before fleeing the grove would bring him back to Margaret's office, their impossible images demanding explanation. But in the moment of capture, Joel finally understood that Diana had been right all along. Some things couldn't be documented, only experienced. The woods had shown him what he needed to see, just as they had shown Thomas and Diana before him. The empty chair wasn't just furniture, it was a door. and somewhere in the watching place it waited for him to understand which side of that door he was really on. The Polaroids spread across Margaret's desk like fallen leaves, each one showing impossible overlaps of time and space. The historian studied them through her wire-rimmed glasses, occasionally comparing them to yellowed photographs from her private collection. "The oldest documented case I have is from 1847, Margaret said, opening a leather-bound journal with careful hands. A trapper named Jean-Baptiste wrote about finding a cabin that walked through seasons. He'd see it in summer with snow on its roof, or in winter surrounded by spring flowers." She turned brittle pages covered in faded French. "He became obsessed with documenting the phenomena just like your grandfather, just like you." Joel touched one of his Polaroids, the one showing multiple versions of himself photographing himself in the birch grove. "These aren't double exposures. I watched the images develop in real time." "Of course they're not." Margaret moved to a filing cabinet marked with a red X, withdrawing a thick folder. "The cameras aren't malfunctioning. They're capturing exactly what's there. Multiple iterations of reality occupying the same space." She spread out a series of 19th century daguerreotypes. "Look familiar?" The old photographs showed the same birch grove from his expedition, but with different people standing in the same poses he'd adopted. Different cameras, different clothes, different eras, but the same fundamental scene playing out again and again. "My great-grandmother was Abenaki," Margaret continued, her voice taking on a new intensity. "She used to tell stories about places in these mountains where time wore thin, said they were doorways left by the spirit world, places where past, present, and future existed simultaneously." She picked up another folder, this one stuffed with newspaper clippings. "I started tracking disappearances in the region after my sister vanished in 1959. That's when I first noticed the pattern." She laid out the clippings in chronological order. Every few decades, clusters of disappearances occurred in the same area, always during specific astronomical alignments. Always preceded by reports of strange lights and time distortions. "The Sullivan case caught my attention because it broke the pattern," Margaret explained. "Instead of a single disappearance, an entire family vanished. And they left behind more documentation than any previous case. Photographs, diary entries, witnesses." "Like my grandmother," Joel said quietly. "Like Claire, yes. And like Thomas, who got closer to understanding the mechanism than anyone before him." Margaret hesitated, then withdrew a final folder from her desk drawer. "I've never shown these to anyone else. They're my sister's drawings, made the week before she disappeared." The drawings showed the same interconnected circles and astronomical symbols that had appeared in Diana's diary margins. The same patterns his grandfather had mapped, the same configuration that would align again in just 2 days. "Your sister?" Joel started to ask, but a new voice interrupted from the doorway. She went through. The elderly woman standing there leaned on a wooden cane, her white hair neatly styled, her eyes sharp and familiar. "Just like my family did, just like Thomas did. But she knew what she was doing. She chose it." Margaret's face had gone pale. "Joel, meet Diana Sullivan, though I suspect you've already seen her younger self recently." Diana moved into the office with careful steps, but her presence filled the space like storm clouds gathering. She looked exactly as an aged version of the girl from the photographs should look. Yet something about her seemed fundamentally wrong, as if she existed slightly out of sync with the surrounding reality. "The chairs are important," she said without preamble, lowering herself into a seat. "Everyone focuses on the doors, the lights, the temporal physics of it all. But it's really about the chairs. Where you choose to sit. When you choose to stay seated." Her eyes fixed on Joel. "Your grandfather understood that, at the end." "The empty chair at the dinner table," Joel said, "in the time loop." Diana's laugh held no humor. "That loop is just an echo, a shadow of the real moment, like ripples spreading from a stone thrown into water. But the stone, the event that caused the ripples that hasn't happened yet, won't happen until the alignment peaks." She reached for Joel's Polaroids, but her hand passed through them on the first try, solidifying only on the second attempt. Time isn't a river, Mr. Winters. It's more like a tree. Some branches wither, others flourish, and sometimes, in special places, all the branches exist simultaneously. What happened to my family? Joel asked quietly. They're exactly where they chose to be. Diana's voice took on a sing-song quality. Where they will choose to be, where they have always been choosing to be. The chair knows. The chair remembers. Margaret intervened, her voice gentle but firm. Diana, you said there was something specific he needed to know about the alignment. Yes. Diana seemed to focus more fully on the present moment. It's not just about the stars this time. The doors are already weakening. Too many passages have created too many branches, too many possibilities trying to exist at once. Reality is becoming, she gestured vaguely, unstable. Like you, Joel observed. Like me. Diana smiled, and for a moment her face shifted, showing the 12-year-old girl she had been and still was, somewhere in the endless loop. I exist in too many versions now. We all do, those of us who went through. But this alignment, it's different, special. A chance to close the doors properly, to prune the excess branches before they tear apart the whole tree. Or, Margaret prompted, or everything collapses. All times, all possibilities, all versions crashing together. Diana's form flickered like bad reception. The empty chair isn't just waiting, Joel. It's counting down. She stood with sudden urgency. The watching place will open fully at peak alignment. But remember, the door your grandfather found isn't the only one. And some of us, her image, began to fade around the edges. Some of us have been planning this moment for a very, very long time. With that, Diana simply ceased to be, leaving behind only a faint scent of wood smoke and the impossible Polaroid spread across Margaret's desk. In the silence that followed, Joel noticed that all the clocks in the office had stopped at different times, their hands pointing to hours that contradicted each other. Margaret gathered the photographs with trembling hands. I've spent decades documenting these phenomena, she said quietly. But I've never seen the boundaries this thin before. Whatever's coming, Joel, it's bigger than just finding out what happened to your grandfather. How long until the alignment peaks? 48 hours. Margaret checked her calculations. Maybe less if Diana's right about the degradation of temporal boundaries. Joel picked up the Polaroid showing his multiple selves in the birch grove. In the background of the image, barely visible, a young girl watched from behind a tree, while an elderly woman's reflection showed in his camera's lens. He had 48 hours to understand what Diana and his grandfather had discovered about the empty chair. 48 hours before all possible timelines converged. 48 hours to decide which side of the door he really wanted to be on. The storm hit just as Joel reached home, wind howling through the mountain passes like something wounded. He found Claire in the kitchen, surrounded by lit candles, their flames casting wild shadows as the power flickered and died. She didn't seem surprised to see him despite the late hour and worsening weather. Diana visited Margaret's office today, Joel said, watching his grandmother's face in the unstable light, both versions of her, past and present, overlapping. Claire's hand stilled on the candle she'd been adjusting. Then it's starting, the collapse she warned us about. Us? Joel sat down heavily. You've been in contact with her all along, haven't you? Thunder rattled the windows as Claire moved to the china cabinet. She pressed something beneath its edge, and a hidden drawer slid open. Sarah Sullivan wasn't just my best friend, she said, withdrawing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. She was my ally, my partner in something we barely understood. The letters, Joel saw, were written in Diana's distinctive hand, but not the childish scrawl from her diary. These showed the graduated changes of someone writing over decades, though the postmarks were impossible. Some were dated years before Diana's birth, others from years that hadn't happened yet. The lights chose our families, Claire continued, her voice nearly lost in another thunderclap. The Sullivans and the Winters. We thought it was random at first, the strange occurrences, the time slips, the feeling of being watched by something vast and patient. She spread the letters across the table. But Diana understood before any of us. She saw how it all connected. Joel picked up one letter, dated 1955, 7 years before Diana's family moved to the cabin. It read simply, "The chair is ready. The door is forming. Remember your promise." "What promise?" he asked. "To maintain the balance." Claire's voice had taken on a distant quality. "You see, the doors want to open. They're always trying to open, to let all possible times flow together. But that would destroy everything. Past, present, future, all collapsing into chaos." She touched one of the candle flames. "Unless there are anchors, people who sit in the right chairs at the right moments, holding the threads of time separate and distinct." The storm's intensity increased, wind screaming around the house's eaves. In its voice, Joel almost thought he could hear fragments of other times, children's laughter, dinner conversations, moments that had happened or would happen or might never happen at all. Thomas discovered part of the truth through his photographs. Claire continued. "The scientific approach, measuring alignments and documenting phenomena. But Sarah and I, we learned a different way. Through Diana's gifts, through the watching place, through the ritual." "What ritual?" Claire's laugh held an edge of hysteria, the one that's been repeating since 1962, the one you see through the cabin window, that endless dinner scene. It's not just a loop, Joel. It's a holding pattern, a moment stretched and sustained to prevent something worse from happening. She withdrew a final letter from her robe pocket, the paper fresh and crisp. "Diana sent this yesterday, or will send it tomorrow. Time is becoming fluid again, the barriers wearing thin." She handed it to Joel with trembling fingers. "Claire, he's ready. The alignment comes and the chair knows its purpose. But remember the cost of our choices. Remember what the ritual demands. A door held open requires a door held closed. A chair filled requires a chair emptied. Balance in all things." D. "The night they disappeared," Claire said softly, "we attempted the ritual. Thomas with his cameras and calculations, Sarah with her mother's old books, Diana with her inherent understanding of the doors. We thought we could control it, direct it, create a stable passage through time." Lightning flashed, and for a moment Joel saw other versions of the kitchen overlaid on the present. The same space in different decades, different possibilities. Claire's figure seemed to multiply and merge, young and old versions of herself, occupying the same space. "Something went wrong," she continued. "The alignment was perfect, but we didn't understand about the chairs, about how anchors work. Thomas tried to document the process to capture the moment of transition, but you can't photograph a choice being made. Can't record the moment someone decides to hold a door closed so others can pass through." Joel's throat felt tight. "You were there, the night they disappeared, the night he disappeared." "I was the anchor." Claire's voice broke. "The one who stayed behind to hold the door, but I failed. The balance shifted, and instead of a controlled passage, they were all pulled through. Scattered across different branches of time, her hands clenched on the table's edge. Diana's been trying to gather them back ever since to prepare for this moment when the doors grow weak enough for a second attempt. And the empty chair is waiting for the right person to understand its purpose." Claire stood, moving to a corner of the kitchen Joel had never paid much attention to. "You see, I've kept my own chair all these years, my own anchor point." She touched a seemingly ordinary kitchen chair, and under her fingers, it flickered between states. New, aged, non-existent, possible. "The ritual can be attempted again," she said. "Diana's been preparing for it, gathering the scattered threads. But this time, we understand the price. This time, we know what the chairs demand." Thunder shook the house to its foundations. Through the kitchen window, Joel saw lights dancing in the woods, not lightning but the familiar underwater glow Diana had described in her diary. They pulsed in rhythm with the storm, with the flickering candles, with the beating of his own heart. "How long?" he asked. "Until the alignment peaks?" "Less than 40 hours now." Claire's face held both determination and fear. long enough to teach you what you need to know. What Thomas discovered, what Diana saw, what Sarah and I learned too late. She gripped his hands across the table, and her touch felt like electricity, like temporal static building before a storm of possibility. Long enough, she whispered, to show you how to close the door from both sides at once. Dawn painted the woods in watercolor grays as Joel approached the cabin, Claire's instructions echoing in his mind. The morning frost formed impossible patterns on the ground, crystalline structures that seemed to map temporal currents rather than following natural geometry. His grandfather's Leica hung around his neck, though Claire had warned him not to use it during the crossing. The ritual requires surrender, she'd explained, drawing symbols on his palms with her grandmother's silver pen. You can't document and participate at the same time. That was Thomas's mistake. The cabin looked different now that he understood its nature. Reality seemed to bend around it like light refracting through water. The endless dinner scene played out behind its windows, but Joel could now see the subtle variations Claire had taught him to recognize, micro-expressions that revealed the true nature of each participant. Mrs. Sullivan's laugh held a desperate edge. Mr. Sullivan's hands shook slightly as he carved the roast. The boy, Tommy, kept glancing at the empty chair as if expecting someone to materialize there, and Diana watched it all with ancient eyes in a child's face, waiting for the moment she knew would come. Joel approached the back door, where his grandmother's symbols matched the ones he now wore on his palms. The air grew thick, resistant, as he reached for the handle. Claire's voice whispered in his memory. Time is like surface tension on water. Push too hard and you break through. Push just right and you can walk on it. He pushed, feeling reality stretch and give around him. The door opened onto a space that existed in multiple moments simultaneously. Joel stepped through and the world turned inside out. The cabin's interior hit him with a wave of sensory information from multiple time periods at once. The smell of pot roast mingled with decades of dust. Wallpaper aged and renewed in endless cycles. The dining room table shifted between states of use and abandonment, finally settling into the eternal dinner scene he'd witnessed from outside, but now he was part of it. You must be Thomas's boy, Robert Sullivan said, looking up from his carving. We've been expecting you. Joel's throat closed around words he hadn't prepared. These people were both here and gone, alive and vanished, present and eternal. Sarah Sullivan's face flickered between youth and age as she offered him potatoes. Tommy kicked his feet against his chair leg in a rhythm that seemed to match the pulse of time itself. Sit, Diana commanded, gesturing to the empty chair. While you still can. Joel moved toward it, understanding now why it had featured so prominently in his grandfather's photographs. The chair existed in all possible moments, anchoring them together like a nail driven through layers of reality. As he lowered himself into it, he felt time spiraling around him in dizzying currents. Careful now, a familiar voice said from behind him. The first crossing is always the hardest. Joel turned to find Thomas Winters standing in the kitchen doorway, camera in hand, looking exactly as he did in photographs from 1962. His grandfather's eyes held recognition, though this moment occurred decades before Joel's birth. You've been watching, Joel said, through the windows, through time. Thomas nodded. Had to make sure you'd find your way here. Diana said you would, but you know how time can be. Slippery. He moved to the table, his form flickering between ages. The rules are different here. Causality flows in all directions. What will happen has already happened is happening will happen again. The endless loop began to make more sense as Joel experienced it from within. Each repetition wasn't identical, it was more like variations on a theme. Each cycle exploring slightly different possibilities while maintaining the overall structure that prevented temporal collapse. The chair knows, Diana said, her voice carrying echoes of her older self. It remembers all the possibilities, all the choices. She reached for the bread basket, but her hand passed through it on the first try. See? Reality's getting thin. Too many versions trying to exist at once. Joel felt it too, a growing instability in the temporal fabric around them. Outside the cabin's windows, he could see other times bleeding through. Native American hunting parties, colonial settlers, future possibilities that hadn't happened yet. The boundaries between moments were dissolving. That's why we needed the ritual, Thomas explained, raising his camera out of habit before lowering it again. To maintain separation between times, to prevent the collapse. His face showed the weight of decades spent understanding this truth. But something went wrong. The balance shifted. Because you tried to document it, Joel realized. You wanted proof, evidence. Can't photograph time, Diana sang softly. Can't capture choice. The room lurched suddenly, reality stuttering like a skipped record. Joel gripped the chair's arms, feeling how it anchored him in the shifting currents of time. Through the windows, he saw himself watching the scene from outside, camera raised. Past and present began to overlap dangerously. Time to go, Thomas said urgently. The crossing can only last so long before reality fractured. Joel felt himself being pulled in multiple temporal directions at once. Diana's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Remember, she hissed, her face cycling. Through decades of ages. The chair isn't just furniture, it's a choice, a moment preserved. A door held, the world inverted again, and Joel found himself sprawled in the frost outside the cabin. The dinner scene continued its loop behind the windows, but now he understood its true nature. Not a simple repetition, but a complex temporal mechanism holding something vast and dangerous at bay. He looked down at his hands where Claire's symbols had changed. New patterns had written themselves into his skin, marking him as someone who had crossed through time. And in his pocket, he found something impossible. A photograph he hadn't taken, showing himself sitting in the empty chair while Thomas stood in the doorway, and Diana watched with knowing eyes. The image began to fade even as he looked at it, like a Polaroid developing in reverse. But the knowledge remained. The understanding of what the chair truly was, and what it would require of him when the alignment peaked. In less than 30 hours, he would have to make the same choice his grandfather had faced, the same choice Diana had been preparing for across decades of scattered time. The choice of which side of the door to hold closed, and which side to leave open for others to pass through. The first change Joel noticed was in his mother's eyes. The photograph on Claire's mantle had always shown them as brown, but now they were unmistakably green, the same shade as Thomas's, the same shade as his own. He stood before the image, trying to reconcile his memories with this new reality, when his phone rang. The number displayed was impossible, all zeros, stretching beyond the screen's edge. When he answered, he heard his own voice, aged and distant, reciting numbers that matched the astronomical coordinates in his grandfather's charts. "It's starting," Margaret said when he arrived at her office, bringing the altered photograph and a recording of the strange call. "Your crossing created ripples, changes." She spread out her research materials, showing him subtle alterations that had appeared in documents overnight. Names changed spelling, dates shifted by days or weeks. Historical records developed inconsistencies that hadn't existed before. "Here," she pointed to a newspaper article about the Sullivan disappearance. "Yesterday, this reported 4 people missing. Now it says 5. And look at the date. It's shifted 3 days closer to the alignment." She met his eyes gravely. "Reality is trying to accommodate your presence in 1962. It's rewriting itself around the paradox you created." Joel's head throbbed with dual sets of memories. He remembered his mother's eyes being brown, but also remembered them always being green. Remembered the Sullivan case involving 4 people, but also 5. Both versions felt equally real, equally true. "The temporal contamination is spreading," Margaret continued, showing him a map marked with new reports of strange phenomena. "People are calling in about lost time, about seeing impossible things. A woman in town swears she had coffee yesterday with her grandmother who died 30 years ago. A child's diary appeared in the library archives. dated 2025 but written in 1962 ink. She opened her laptop, showing him surveillance footage from a local diner. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m., but the scene was lit by bright daylight. And there, sitting in a booth, was a 12-year-old girl in a dress from 1962, calmly eating pie while reading tomorrow's newspaper. "Diana," Joel breathed. "She's breaking through more frequently now," Margaret confirmed. "The boundaries between times are becoming permeable. Your crossing weakened them further." She rubbed her temples. "I'm developing memories of conversations we won't have until next week. Getting phone calls from numbers that don't exist yet. It's like reality itself is developing temporal vertigo." Joel's phone rang again, all zeros. This time when he answered, he heard Diana's voice, young and old simultaneously. "The chair remembers. The door remembers." "Do you remember yet?" "Remember what?" he asked, but she had already hung up. A photograph slid from between Margaret's files, one that hadn't existed moments before. It showed Joel sitting in the empty chair at the Sullivans' dinner table, but the image was wrong. His figure was transparent, overlaid with Thomas's, while Diana appeared at multiple ages simultaneously. The timestamp showed next Thursday's date. "Your memories will continue to shift," Margaret warned. "The closer we get to the alignment, the more realities will bleed together. You may find yourself remembering futures that haven't happened yet, or pasts that no longer exist." As if to prove her point, Joel suddenly recalled a conversation he would have with Claire tomorrow morning about a letter she had received last week from Sarah Sullivan, postmarked 1961. The memory felt as real as anything else, though he knew it couldn't have happened yet. A knock at the office door made them both jump. A young girl stood there, Diana, exactly as she appeared in the dinner loop. But her dress shifted between decades of styles, and her shadow fell in the wrong direction. "You're running out of time," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "The chair can't hold much longer. Too many possibilities trying to happen at once." She held out a newspaper clipping that hadn't yellowed despite being dated 1962. "Look what's coming." The article described a massive temporal event in the Adirondacks, scheduled to occur in exactly 24 hours. The byline credited a reporter who wouldn't be born for another 30 years. "Reality's getting confused," Diana explained, her form flickering like bad reception. "Past and future are bleeding into each other. The anchors are failing." She touched a photograph on Margaret's desk and it transformed into a different image entirely. "You have to decide soon which side of the door you'll hold." "I don't understand," Joel began, but Diana was already fading. "Ask Claire about the price." Her voice lingered after her form had vanished. "Ask her what it really means to hold a door closed." Margaret gathered the altered documents with shaking hands. "We need to record these changes while we can still remember the original versions, before reality rewrites itself completely." But even as she spoke, the documents shifted again. Names changed, dates realigned. The photograph of Joel in the empty chair now showed him at multiple ages simultaneously, while the cabin behind him cycled through decades of decay and renewal in a single frozen image. His phone rang one final time. The number displayed was his own, but the timestamp showed the call originating next week. When he answered, he heard Claire's voice, aged by decades. "The chair is ready, the door is forming. Remember your promise." "What promise?" he asked. But he was already beginning to remember, a conversation he hadn't had yet, about a choice he hadn't made, in a moment that was simultaneously approaching and eternally present in the endless loop of the Sullivans' last dinner. The cabin waited in the gathering dusk, its windows glowing with that eternal dinner light. But tonight, the scene inside had changed. The familiar loop stuttered and fragmented, showing glimpses of other moments bleeding through. Past versions, future iterations, possibilities that had never quite manifested. Joel found both Dianas waiting for him on the cabin's porch. The child sat in a rocking chair that hadn't been there before, while her elderly self stood leaning on her cane. Between them, reality seemed to bend and fold, their forms occasionally merging before separating again. Time isn't what you think it is, they said in unison, their voices overlapping like a complex chord. It's not a line or even a circle. It's more like... The young Diana raised her hand and frost patterns formed in the air, creating crystalline structures that branched and reconnected in impossible ways. Every choice creates new branches, elderly Diana continued, new possibilities. But sometimes, the branches grow too heavy. Sometimes they need to be pruned. She gestured toward the cabin's window, where the dinner scene had frozen mid-moment. That's what the loop is really for, not preserving a moment, but preventing one. What? Moment? Joel asked, though part of him was already beginning to remember, future conversations bleeding backward into the present, knowledge he hadn't acquired yet seeping through the thinning walls of time. The moment everything breaks. Young Diana's voice carried centuries of weight. We saw it coming, all those branches growing too heavy, too tangled. Reality starting to tear under the strain of too many possibilities trying to exist at once. She pointed to the empty chair, visible through the window. That's why we created the anchor points, the chairs that hold reality steady while time flows around them. But anchors require anchors, her older self added. Someone has to sit. Someone has to hold the door closed so others can pass through safely. She met Joel's eyes. Your grandfather understood that, once he stopped trying to document and started trying to participate. The scene through the window shifted, showing Thomas Winters entering the cabin on that fatal night in 1962. Joel watched his grandfather set up his camera, watched him begin to understand what the empty chair really meant. He tried to save us, young Diana said, her form flickering between ages. When he realized what was coming, the collapse, the convergence of all possible timelines, he thought he could document it, prove it, prevent it. She smiled sadly. But you can't photograph time unwinding. You can only experience it, choose your moment, and hold it steady. The Sullivan family, Joel said slowly, they didn't just disappear, did they? We scattered ourselves, elderly Diana confirmed. Distributed our anchors across different times, different branches, holding reality steady from multiple points. She gestured at her younger self. I exist in every moment simultaneously, because I have to. The loop needs witnesses as well as anchors. The dinner scene resumed its cycle, but now Joel could see the subtle variations, the ways each family member shifted between states of being. They're all still there, he realized, still choosing, still holding their positions. But the weight is becoming too much, young Diana warned. Too many branches, too many possibilities. The alignment approaches, and this time, she looked at her older self. This time, everything converges. Elderly Diana nodded. Your grandfather saw it coming. That's why he took his position, holding one of the crucial nodes in the temporal network. But his anchor point is failing. The chair remembers, but memory isn't enough anymore. It needs new choice, new commitment. The frost patterns in the air grew more complex, showing the interweaving of timelines and possibilities. Joel saw himself, reflected in them, past versions, future iterations, choices made and unmade. That's why you led me here, he said. Why you've been orchestrating events across decades. You need someone to take his place. The chair is empty for a reason, both Dianas said together. It's waiting for a choice that's already been made, will be made, must be made. Their forms began to merge again, creating a composite being that existed in all times simultaneously. But you have to understand the cost, what it means to hold a door closed while everyone else walks through. The dinner scene froze again, but this time Joel saw what he'd been missing. The way each family member's gaze held recognition and grief. The way they performed their roles in the loop while maintaining their awareness. Their choice to remain as anchors in the temporal machinery. If I take his place, Joel began. You'll exist everywhere and nowhere, Diana's merged voice explained. Like us, holding reality steady while time flows around you, living the same moment over and over but experiencing all moments simultaneously. Her form separated again into young and old versions. It's not a prison, Joel, it's a purpose, a calling. And if I refuse, The frost patterns shattered, showing glimpses of possible futures, realities collapsing, time itself unraveling as too many branches tried to exist at once. Then everything falls, young Diana said simply. All times, all possibilities, all versions of reality crashing together. Your grandfather made his choice, elderly Diana added. Chose to hold the door closed so others could pass safely through. But his anchor is failing. The chair remembers, but it needs new commitment, new sacrifice. Joel looked through the window at the empty chair, his grandfather's chair, waiting through decades for this moment of decision. He understood now why Thomas had stopped taking photographs, why he had chosen to participate rather than document. Some choices couldn't be recorded, only lived. How long? He asked. Until the alignment peaks, both Dianas answered. When all possible timelines converge, they began to fade, their forms becoming transparent as reality reasserted itself. Choose quickly, Joel Winters. The chair remembers, but memory alone isn't enough to hold back time. They vanished, leaving Joel alone with the cabin and its eternal dinner scene. Through the window, the empty chair waited, not just furniture now, but a door, a choice, a moment preserved through decades of sacrifice. And somewhere in the complex machinery of time, his grandfather waited to be relieved of his post. The boundary between times had grown so thin that Joel could step through it almost casually now, like walking through a beaded curtain. He found Thomas in the cabin's kitchen, methodically dismantling his camera equipment while the Sullivan family's dinner loop played out in the next room. The scene stuttered and fragmented, showing multiple versions of itself simultaneously. I used to be like you, Thomas said without looking up, thinking I could capture it, document it, prove what was happening. He held up a lens, watching light refract through it in impossible ways. Took me too long to understand that some things can't be witnessed, only experienced. Joel studied his grandfather, younger than in any photograph he'd known, but with eyes that held decades of accumulated knowledge. Time had begun to blur around Thomas's edges, showing glimpses of other versions, other moments. When did you first understand what Diana could do? That's the wrong question. Thomas set down the lens carefully. The real question is, when did I understand what she had to do? What we all had to do? He gestured toward the dining room where the family cycled through their eternal meal. Look at them. Really look. Joel watched as the scene played out, again. But this time he saw what his grandfather meant. The subtle awareness in their expressions. The deliberate quality of their movements. This wasn't a family trapped in a loop. It was a family performing a vital function, maintaining a crucial point in the temporal machinery. They're all conscious, Joel realized. They all chose this. Had to choose it. That's what makes it work. Thomas moved to the window, where other times were visible through the glass. Past and future versions of the cabin layered like transparent sheets. Diana showed me the truth. About the branches of time growing too heavy. About reality, starting to tear under the weight of too many possibilities. He touched the window, and frost patterns formed beneath his fingers, showing the same crystalline structures Diana had demonstrated. The Sullivans were chosen because they could perceive the problem. Diana most of all. She saw how time was fraying, how the branches needed pruning before everything collapsed. But something went wrong, Joel prompted. Thomas's laugh held no humor. Everything went wrong, and right, and neither. When you're dealing with time, causality gets complicated. He turned to face Joel fully. I came here to document strange lights in the woods. Ended up discovering that reality itself was in danger of unraveling, that certain points in space-time needed to be anchored, held steady while everything else flowed around them. The dinner scene reset again, but this time Joel saw other iterations bleeding through. Future versions, past attempts, possibilities that had almost manifested. The empty chair, he said slowly. It's not just waiting for someone. It's waiting for a specific choice. The choice to hold position, Thomas confirmed, to become an anchor point in the temporal framework. The Sullivans each took their positions, scattered across different branches of time. But we needed one more anchor, one more fixed point to hold everything steady. Joel watched his grandfather's form flicker between ages, between positions, in space-time. You volunteered. Had to. Diana showed me what would happen if we didn't establish enough anchor points, reality tearing itself apart as too many timelines tried to exist simultaneously. Thomas picked up his camera one last time, then deliberately set it aside. Your grandmother, Claire understood before I did. She saw what Diana was trying to prevent, tried to warn me that you can't photograph time unwinding. The scene in the dining room fragmented further, showing glimpses of other moments, Claire discovering the truth, Sarah Sullivan explaining, the ritual, Diana demonstrating her ability to exist in multiple times at once. The ritual wasn't just about creating anchor points, Thomas continued. It was about choosing them consciously, willingly. Each person understanding exactly what they were sacrificing and choosing it anyway. He met Joel's eyes. But I couldn't let go of my need to document, to prove. That's why my anchor point is failing now. Why the chair remembers but can't hold much longer. Joel felt the weight of accumulated time pressing around them. What happens when it fails completely? Everything happens all at once. Every possibility, every branch, every moment converging into chaos. Thomas gestured at the frost patterns, which had begun to crack and splinter. Unless someone takes my place, someone who understands what it really means to hold position, while time flows around you. The dinner scene stuttered again, and Joel saw his grandfather as he truly was, existing in multiple states simultaneously, holding a crucial node in the temporal framework through sheer force of will. But the effort was clearly taking its toll. Reality flickered and warped around Thomas's form, showing the strain of maintaining his position. Claire never told me, Joel said softly, about your choice, about any of this. She couldn't. Some knowledge has to be earned, not given, has to be chosen, not inherited. Thomas moved to the dining room doorway, watching the Sullivan family perform their eternal duties. They chose to anchor reality by maintaining this moment, this scene. I chose to help maintain the larger framework. And now I have to choose, Joel finished. The chair remembers, Thomas said, his form beginning to fade. But memory isn't enough anymore. It needs new commitment, new understanding. He looked at Joel one last time, his expression both proud and grieving. The question isn't whether you'll take my place. Diana's already shown you that you will. Must. The question is whether you'll understand why, when the moment comes. The scene began to dissolve around them, reality reasserting its normal flow. But before Thomas faded completely, he said one final thing. Ask Claire about the price of holding position, about what it really means to anchor time. She understands, better than any of us. She's been holding her own position all these years, waiting for this moment. Joel found himself standing outside the cabin once more, watching the dinner scene reset through frosted windows. But now he saw it with new eyes, not as a trap or a loop, but as a vital function in the machinery of reality. A choice being made over and over, maintaining the stability of time itself. And in the dining room, the empty chair waited for him to understand exactly what that choice would cost. Joel found Claire in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. The house felt different after his conversation with Thomas. Time seemed to move strangely through its rooms, like water finding new channels. You've spoken with him, Claire said. Not a question. You've seen what he became, what we all became. She stood with effort, moving to the basement door, a door Joel realized he'd never seen opened in all his years visiting the house. The key she produced looked ancient, its metal dark with age and handling. I've maintained my own anchor point, she said, unlocking the door. All these years, holding position in my own way. The basement stairs creaked as they descended, each step seeming to take them further from normal time. At the bottom, Claire flipped a switch and Joel's breath caught. The space was an exact mirror of the cabin's dining room. The table, the chairs, the wallpaper, everything matched the eternal dinner scene he'd been watching through frosted windows. But here, the objects showed their true age. The tablecloth was worn thin, the chairs scratched and repaired countless times. And everywhere, covering every surface, were temporal markers, astronomical charts, photographs showing impossible overlaps, letters dated from years that hadn't happened yet. Sarah helped me set it up, Claire explained, moving to adjust. A chair that Joel realized matched the empty one in the cabin exactly. Before they took their positions, we knew someone would have to maintain connection from outside, keep the anchor point synchronized. She touched the table's surface and frost patterns formed beneath her fingers, the same crystalline structures he'd seen Diana create. The ritual isn't just about holding position, it's about maintaining awareness across all the branches, all the possibilities, keeping the connection stable. Joel examined the walls, covered in what looked like star charts but showing impossibly complex patterns. You've been tracking them, all the anchor points. Had to. When they scattered themselves across time, someone needed to remember where, when, everyone was positioned. Claire's hands shook as she straightened a photograph showing the Sullivan family in multiple temporal states simultaneously. Diana helps when she can, sending messages across the years, but mostly it's been me, maintaining the framework from this side of time. She opened a drawer, withdrawing a leather-bound book filled with her careful handwriting. Every family that's been affected, every person who's had to choose a position and hold it. The Sullivans weren't the first, you know, just the ones who understood it best. Joel read names, dates, coordinates, a catalog of others who had discovered what he was learning now. Some had fled from the knowledge. Others had taken positions of their own, becoming anchor points in the vast machinery of time. The protection spell, he said slowly. It's killing you, isn't it? Claire's smile held decades of tired determination. Living in all times at once, it takes a toll. Diana warned me it would. But someone had to maintain connection, keep the network stable while Thomas held his position. She touched another photograph, this one showing her younger self with Sarah Sullivan. We made a pact, Sarah and I, to protect our families no matter the cost. The basement air grew thick with temporal static as Claire moved to the head of the table. Reality seemed to bend around her, showing glimpses of other moments. Claire, maintaining her vigil across decades, sending messages through time, holding her position while the world flowed around her. The hardest part wasn't the ritual itself, she said softly. It was watching you grow up, knowing what was coming, knowing you'd have to face this choice too. She gestured at the chair that matched the empty one in the cabin. I've kept it ready, kept everything synchronized, but my strength is failing now. The protection is breaking down. As if to demonstrate, the air rippled visibly. Joel saw other versions of the basement, other iterations of Claire's vigil layering over each other like transparent sheets. His grandmother's form flickered between ages, showing the toll of existing partially and multiple times. Diana says, reality is becoming unstable, he said, that all possible timelines are starting to converge. Claire nodded, her movement leaving temporal echoes in the air. The anchor points are failing. Thomas's position, my connection point here, we can't hold much longer. She opened another drawer, withdrawing letters he recognized from Diana's future self. It's all connected. Every family that's been touched by this, every person who's had to make the choice. We're all just nodes in a larger pattern. She swayed suddenly, catching herself on the table's edge. Joel moved to support her, but his hands passed through several versions of her before finding purchase. I'm sorry, she whispered. I wanted to protect you from this knowledge, from this choice. But Diana was right. Some things have to be chosen, not inherited, have to be understood, not just accepted. The basement lights flickered, showing glimpses of other moments, the same space at different points in time, Claire maintaining her vigil across decades. Each image revealed the growing cost of her dedication, the way holding position had slowly drained her strength. "How long?" Joel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Until the alignment peaks. A matter of hours now." Claire's voice held both exhaustion and relief. "Long enough to show you what you need to know, what the ritual really requires." She met his eyes, her gaze steady despite her weakening form. "Long enough to understand why some choices have to be made over and over, no matter the cost." The air thickened further with temporal static as Claire began to explain the true nature of her vigil and the price of maintaining position, while time itself threatened to unravel around them. The woods around the cabin had become a kaleidoscope of collapsing time. Joel watched Native American hunters pass through the same space where colonial settlers raised cabins, while future versions of the forest flickered in and out of existence. The air itself seemed to be coming apart, reality fragmenting into layers that shifted and merged like oil on water. Margaret's voice crackled through his phone, distorted by temporal interference. "The alignment is accelerating. Reality's starting to—" Her words cut off as the phone cycled through multiple versions of itself, becoming simultaneously new and ancient before settling back into its present form. The cabin stood at the center of the chaos, its windows showing dozens of overlapping scenes. Joel could see the Sullivan family's eternal dinner, but now other moments bled through. The day they first discovered the cabin, the morning Diana first saw the lights, the night they made their final choice. 3 versions of Diana appeared beside him, aged 12, 40, and elderly, their forms merging and separating like waves on a shore. "You're making it worse," they said in unison. "Your presence here, straddling multiple times, it's destabilizing." The anchor points. Inside the cabin, Joel watched Thomas setting up his camera equipment, unaware that in a matter of hours he would choose to become part of the temporal machinery. Sarah Sullivan moved through the kitchen preparing the dinner that would become eternal, while her husband Robert studied star charts that showed impossible alignments. "We all knew," the Dianas continued, their voices echoing strangely. "What would happen? What had to happen? What will always happen?" Their forms flickered as reality stuttered around them. But knowing isn't the same as choosing. The scene through the windows shifted, showing the Sullivan family gathered for their last normal dinner. Joel saw the moment understanding dawned. In their eyes, the realization of what they would have to become to prevent reality's collapse. Young Diana explained something, gesturing with hands that left trails in the air, while her parents' faces showed the weight of the choice before them. "Stop," Joel said, but he wasn't sure who he was talking to, the family in their last moments of normalcy, or himself watching it unfold. The air cracked like glass, showing glimpses of other possibilities, versions where the family had refused their duty, where reality had begun to tear apart as temporal branches grew too heavy. Joel saw cities where multiple time periods existed simultaneously, people who aged backwards and forwards at random, children who remembered futures that would never happen. Margaret appeared beside him, then fragmented into multiple versions of herself. "The collapse is spreading," they said. "Other anchor points are failing. The network can't hold much longer." Through the cabin's windows, Joel watched Thomas make his final attempt to document the phenomenon. But now he saw what his grandfather had seen, the way reality itself was coming undone, the way normal time was beginning to dissolve under the weight of too many possibilities. The dinner scene reset again, but this time the loop was erratic. The family moved through their roles with increasing urgency, aware that their moment of choice approached. Young Diana kept glancing at the empty chair, while her mother's hands shook as she served portions that would never be eaten. "You have to decide," the Dianas said, their forms becoming increasingly unstable. "Whether to let this happen, whether to intervene, whether to understand why we chose what we chose." Reality fractured further. Joel saw his grandfather in multiple moments simultaneously, setting up his camera, realizing the truth, making his choice to hold position. Saw Claire maintaining her vigil across decades. saw the Sullivan family scattering themselves across time to serve as anchor points in the vast machinery of reality. The empty chair flickered between states, showing all its possible occupants at once. Joel saw himself sitting there in countless iterations, making and unmaking the choice that would determine not just his future, but the stability of time itself. It's starting, Margaret's fragments warned. The final phase of collapse, when all possible times try to exist at once. The air grew thick with temporal static, making it difficult to move or think clearly. Through the windows, Joel watched the Sullivan family's last dinner reaching its crucial moment. Saw Diana explain what needed to be done. Saw her parents accept their roles in what was to come. Saw Thomas set aside his camera, finally understanding that some things couldn't be documented, only experienced. Choose, the Dianas commanded as their forms began to dissolve into pure temporal energy. Before there's nothing left to choose between. Reality shuddered around them, time itself groaning under the strain of too many possibilities. And through it all, the empty chair waited, not just for an occupant but for understanding, for the choice that would determine whether time would continue to flow, or finally shatter under the weight of its own infinite branches. The middle-aged version of Diana coalesced from the temporal chaos, her form more solid than Joel had ever seen it. She stood in the cabin's doorway while reality fractured around them, her smile holding something that made Joel's blood run cold. "You've finally understood enough," she said, her voice carrying echoes of both her childhood and elderly selves. "Enough to be useful. Enough to break everything." The dinner scene behind her had frozen mid-moment, the Sullivan family trapped between seconds. But now Joel saw something new in their expressions. Not willing sacrifice, but desperate pleading. His grandfather's form flickered in the corner, trying to warn him through decades of temporal static. "You've been manipulating everything," Joel realized. The messages, the clues, the gradual revelation of the truth. "You wanted me to destabilize the anchor points." "Of course I did." Diana stepped fully into the present moment, leaving ripples in reality around her. "Do you have any idea what it's like? Existing in all time simultaneously, feeling every moment of your life happening at once?" Her form briefly fragmented, showing glimpses of all her other selves. "We thought we were being noble, scattering ourselves across time to maintain stability. But we became prisoners instead." She moved to the dining table, touching the empty chair. Frost patterns formed beneath her fingers, but these were jagged, aggressive, nothing like the delicate structures she'd shown him before. This chair isn't waiting for someone to maintain the pattern. It's waiting for someone to break it, someone with the right bloodline, the right understanding, the right moment of choice. "My grandfather," Joel said. "You led him here originally. Because he could have done it. Could have shattered the loop instead of reinforcing it." Diana's laugh held decades of bitterness, but he was too responsible, too concerned with the greater good. When he understood what was at stake, he chose to help maintain the prison instead of breaking it. Reality rippled around them as she paced, showing glimpses of other moments, other families trapped in similar loops, other anchor points maintaining the vast machinery of time. "We're not the only ones, you know. There are dozens of us scattered throughout history, holding position while time flows around us. All thinking we're being so noble, so self-sacrificing." She gestured at her frozen family. "Look at them. Really, look. Do they seem happy in their eternal moment? Do they look like willing participants in some grand cosmic plan?" Joel studied their expressions with new eyes. The desperation he'd noticed before seemed more pronounced. But something wasn't right. The expressions shifted subtly when Diana wasn't looking directly at them, showing different emotions entirely. "You're lying," he said slowly. "Showing me what you want me to see." Diana's face hardened. "I'm showing you the truth. One version of it, anyway." She moved to the window where temporal chaos continued to build outside. Reality is already breaking down. The alignment approaches, and this time, I've made sure all the pieces are in place. a winter's at the crucial moment, with just enough understanding to make the right choice. The wrong choice, Thomas's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. The choice that ends everything. The choice that frees us. Diana's form flickered violently. Do you think time itself will really unravel if we break the loop? That's what they want you to believe. What they convinced us to believe. So we'd maintain our positions like good little soldiers. But Joel saw the truth now in the temporal. Chaos outside, the way reality itself was coming apart as the anchor points failed. This wasn't just about freeing people from loops. This was about the fundamental stability of time. How many? He asked. How many other families have you manipulated like this? How many potential breakers have you led to their anchor points? As many as it takes. Diana's voice had lost any pretense of warmth. For decades, I've been planting seeds across timelines, leaving clues, creating connections, manipulating events to place the right people at the right moments. And now, finally everything aligns. She smiled, and in her expression Joel saw the weight of centuries. You're the key, Joel. The culmination of all my planning. The one who will finally break the cycle. But even as she spoke, Joel noticed other changes. The frozen dinner scene was showing cracks, moments of truth bleeding through Diana's manipulated version. He saw his grandfather's choice made with full understanding, not blind nobility. Saw the Sullivan family accepting their roles with clear eyes, not desperate submission. Saw younger Diana herself comprehending the true stakes before her older self's bitterness had twisted everything. You're not just trying to free yourself, he realized. You're willing to sacrifice everything, all of reality, for your own escape. Reality is overrated. Diana's form began to blur at the edges. Do you have any idea what it's like in the loops? The eternal now, the constant awareness, the weight of all possible moments pressing against your consciousness? Her voice took on a manic edge. Breaking free is worth any cost. Even if that cost includes everyone and everything else? Especially then. She moved toward him, her form leaving temporal traces in the air. Make the choice, Joel. Take the, chair, but instead of holding position, let go completely. Let time itself unwind. Let all the branches collapse into blessed chaos. The empty chair waited between them, its purpose now clear. Not just an anchor point, but a fulcrum on which all reality balanced. Diana had led him here, manipulated, events across decades, all to place him at this moment of decision. But she hadn't counted on him seeing through her lies. Hadn't anticipated that the very temporal chaos she'd created would reveal the truth she'd tried to hide. Outside the cabin, reality continued to fracture, and somewhere in the temporal machinery, Joel's grandfather held his position, waiting to see which choice his grandson would make. Reality splintered like broken glass around the cabin as young Diana materialized beside her older self, the two versions facing Joel across the eternal dinner scene. Between them, the empty chair pulsed with temporal energy, existing in all possible states simultaneously. Choose, the older Diana commanded, her voice carrying echoes of centuries of bitter captivity. End this. Free us all. Save everything, her younger self countered, and Joel finally understood the truth. This wasn't just two versions of Diana. This was the moment of division, when one version had chosen bitter rebellion, while the other had accepted necessary sacrifice. The dinner scene fractured, showing all its iterations at once. Joel watched the Sullivan family make their choice over and over, each time with full understanding of what it meant. Saw his grandfather set aside his camera with clear eyes, accepting his role in the vast machinery of time. The moments overlapped and merged, revealing the truth Diana's older self had tried to hide. They chose, Joel said softly. All of them. They knew exactly what they were doing. They chose imprisonment. Older Diana's form flickered violently, eternal captivity in moments that never end. They chose to maintain reality itself, young Diana corrected, her voice carrying the weight of understanding yet to be twisted by centuries of isolation. To hold position while time flows around them, keeping the branches stable. The cabin, Walls became transparent, showing the full scope of temporal collapse outside. Joel saw other anchor points failing across history, other families maintaining their own eternal moments, keeping reality from unraveling. Each one, a crucial node, in a vast network of choice and sacrifice. Joel? Claire stood in the doorway, her form shifting between ages as she fought to maintain presence in the destabilizing present. She moved to the table with effort, temporal static crackling around her. Mom knew, she said, gesturing at Sarah Sullivan's frozen form. She saw this moment coming, saw both versions of her daughter trying to influence the outcome. Claire touched the empty chair, and frost patterns bloomed beneath her fingers, perfect crystalline structures showing the true nature of time's flow. That's why she left the choice to you. There is no choice. Older Diana's voice shook, the foundations of reality. Only escape or eternal imprisonment. There's always choice, young Diana countered. That's what makes the anchors work. Willing sacrifice, freely chosen. The temporal chaos intensified as the alignment approached its peak. Joel saw all possible versions of this moment overlapping, versions where he accepted Diana's manipulation, versions where he refused, versions where he tried to walk away entirely. But beneath them all, he finally understood what his grandfather had realized decades ago. This wasn't about imprisonment or escape. It wasn't even about choice, not really. It was about understanding, about seeing the true pattern beneath reality's surface and accepting your place within it. Thomas's form manifested briefly, his expression both proud and grieving. The chair remembers, he said, his voice barely audible through temporal static. But memory isn't enough anymore. It needs new commitment, new understanding. Don't you dare, older Diana snarled, her form becoming increasingly unstable. Don't you dare maintain their prison. It was never a prison. Young Diana said softly. That's what you forgot, what you let centuries of isolation twist into bitterness. It was always about protection, about maintaining the stability that allows time itself to flow. Reality groaned around them as the alignment reached its crucial moment. Joel felt the weight of all possible choices pressing against him, seeking resolution. Through the cabin's dissolving walls, he saw the full scope of what Diana's freedom would cost. All of reality unraveling, all times collapsing into chaos, the very fabric of existence tearing apart. Joel, please, Claire whispered, her form flickering like a candle in temporal wind. Remember what the chair really means. And he did remember. Remembered every photograph he'd taken, every moment he'd tried to capture and preserve. Remembered his grandfather choosing to set aside documentation in favor of participation. Remembered that some things couldn't be witnessed, only experienced. The empty chair pulsed with possibility as Joel stepped toward it. Both versions of Diana moved to stop him, one seeking to prevent what she saw as eternal imprisonment, the other trying to ensure the choice remained truly free. But in the end, it wasn't their choice to make. Joel reached for the chair, understanding. At last, what his grandfather had discovered, what Claire had protected, what the Sullivan family had chosen to become, understanding that some moments had to be maintained, some patterns held stable, some choices made over and over to keep reality itself from unraveling. He sat down, and in that eternal moment, as time fractured and reformed around him, Joel Winters made his choice. The moment Joel sat in the chair, everything changed. Reality crystallized around him like frost forming on glass, showing him the true nature of the temporal machinery he'd inherited. The cabin existed in all times simultaneously now, its walls transparent to reveal the infinite branches of possibility, stretching in every direction. No! Older Diana's form began to disintegrate, her centuries of careful manipulation unraveling. You're supposed to break it, not transform it. Young Diana finished, her expression peaceful as she watched, her bitter future self fade. That's what Mom knew was possible, what Thomas discovered, what Claire protected all these years. Joel felt the weight of time flowing around him, understanding at last what his grandfather had maintained for so long. The anchor points weren't prison cells. They were transformation engines, places where reality could be reshaped by conscious choice. The ritual was never about breaking or maintaining, he said, his voice carrying new authority as he assumed his position in the temporal framework. It was about evolution, about letting the pattern change without letting it collapse. The Sullivan family began to stir from their frozen state, awakening to this moment of transformation. Sarah looked at her daughter's younger self with profound love and understanding. "You knew this would happen," she said softly. "That's why you left the clues, why you helped guide him here." "Part of me knew," young Diana acknowledged as her older self faded completely. The part that hadn't forgotten what the anchor points really mean. Reality shuddered as Joel began the transformation, guided by instincts he didn't know he possessed. The chair wasn't just a fixed point anymore. It was a fulcrum, a place where the weight of time could be redistributed, reformed, renewed. Thomas's form materialized fully, no longer flickering between states. "The pattern can be changed," he said, moving to stand beside his grandson. "But it has to be changed from within, by someone who understands both documentation and participation." Claire appeared at Joel's other side, her strength returning as the new pattern began to form. "That's why it had to be you," she told Joel. "Someone who knows how to capture moments and experience them simultaneously. Someone who could see the truth beneath Diana's manipulation." The cabin walls pulsed with temporal energy as Joel began to reshape the anchor point. Instead of a single, frozen moment, the loop transformed into a flowing sequence, still eternal but no longer static. The Sullivan family moved through their roles with new awareness, maintaining the stability of time itself while existing in a state of constant, conscious evolution. "It's not about holding everything still," Joel realized as he worked. "It's about directing the flow, creating channels for time to move through safely." Young Diana approached the table, her form becoming more solid as the new pattern stabilized. "That's what I tried to tell myself," she said, glancing at where her older self had vanished. Before isolation twisted understanding into bitterness. The anchor points aren't cells, they're watersheds, places where time's flow can be guided and shaped. The transformation accelerated as Joel fully embraced his role. Reality reformed around them, the infinite branches of possibility finding new configurations. Other anchor points across history responded, their patterns shifting to match the evolution of this crucial node. Thomas placed a hand on Joel's shoulder, the contact grounding them both in this eternal moment. "The chair remembers," he said, "but now it also learns, changes, grows." Sarah Sullivan gathered her family close as their loop transformed from prison to possibility. "We maintain the pattern," she said, "but the pattern maintains us too. Keeps us connected across all possible times, all potential futures." Outside the cabin, reality continued to fracture. But now the fractures were healing themselves, finding new paths through the transformed anchor points. The temporal chaos resolved into more complex but stable patterns, like a river finding new channels after a flood. Claire moved to stand at the head of the table, her decades of vigilance finally bearing fruit. "The protection spell isn't about preventing change," she said. "It's about ensuring that change happens in ways that preserve what matters most." Joel felt the weight of his position settling into new configurations. He was still an anchor point, still maintaining crucial stability in the temporal machinery, but now that stability was dynamic rather than static. The eternal dinner scene flowed around him like water, each iteration slightly different while maintaining its essential purpose. "We don't have to be prisoners of eternal moments," he said, understanding flooding through him. "We can be guardians of eternal possibility." The cabin completed its transformation, its walls becoming permeable to time's flow while maintaining their crucial structure. The Sullivan family moved through their roles with new grace, aware of their part in the vast machinery of reality but no longer bounded by a single frozen moment. And somewhere in the complex pattern of time itself, an older, bitter Diana found the peace she'd been seeking for centuries. Not in escape, but in transformation. in the understanding that some cycles didn't need to be broken, only reshaped into something new. Dawn painted the Adirondacks in watercolor light as Joel stood in Claire's basement, watching her ritual space transform. The table that had mirrored the cabin's eternal dinner scene now shifted between states of being, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, always maintaining its connection to the vast machinery of time. "The protection spell is changing," Claire said, touching the table's surface. Frost patterns formed and reformed beneath her fingers, showing new configurations of possibility. Not ending, just evolving, like everything else. Joel understood. Since the transformation of the anchor point, reality had been settling into new patterns. His memories now existed in multiple layers. He remembered both the original timeline and the changed one, remembered events that had and hadn't happened, choices made and unmade. Margaret's voice crackled through his phone, which now displayed impossible timestamps for each call. "The historical records are stabilizing, but they're different. The disappearances we documented, they're resolving themselves in new ways." She was right. Joel could feel it in the temporal currents that still flowed around him even away from the cabin. The Sullivan family wasn't missing anymore. They were present in a different way, existing in a state of quantum flux that allowed them to maintain their anchor point while still participating in the flow of time. "It's like looking through a prism," Thomas said. His form was more stable now, able to manifest clearly in specific moments. Reality splits and recombines, but the light still gets through. They gathered in Claire's kitchen, where 3 place settings still waited at the table. But now the settings shifted and changed, accommodating whoever needed to be present in each moment. The empty chair had become a door that opened when necessary, closed when required. "Young Diana was right," Claire said, pouring coffee that steamed with temporal energy. "The anchor points were never meant to be static. They were waiting for someone who could understand how to transform them." "And older Diana?" Joel asked, though he already knew. "Found her peace," Thomas answered. When the pattern changed, all possible versions of her merged and separated, chose new configurations. She exists now in a state of constant evolution, like the rest of us. Margaret arrived with her arms full of documentation, photographs, articles, historical records that showed the new shape of reality. "The changes are still propagating," she said, spreading the materials across Claire's table. "But they're stabilizing into coherent patterns." Joel examined a photograph that shifted under his gaze, showing multiple versions of the cabin existing simultaneously. Inside, the Sullivan family moved through their eternal moment, but now that moment flowed like water, allowing change while maintaining essential stability. "The other anchor points?" he asked. "Transforming," Claire confirmed. "Following the pattern we established. The temporal network is becoming more flexible, more resilient." She touched one of Margaret's documents and the text rearranged itself to show new histories, new possibilities. In the basement, they could hear the ritual space continuing its transformation. The protection spell had become something new, not a barrier against change, but a channel for it. Claire's decades of vigilance had evolved into a different kind of guardianship. "Your memories will settle eventually," Thomas told Joel. "You'll learn to navigate between the layers, to understand how multiple realities can coexist without collapsing into chaos." Joel felt it happening already. His photographer's eye had adapted to seeing multiple exposures of reality layered over each other, while his newfound role as an anchor point let him understand how those layers interconnected. "The cabin itself is different," Margaret noted, showing them new photographs. The structure now existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent, eternal and evolving. "It's becoming a nexus point, a place where multiple timelines can safely intersect." Sarah Sullivan's voice echoed through Claire's kitchen, carried on temporal currents. "We maintain the pattern and the pattern maintains us, but now the maintenance goes both ways." Joel understood what she meant. The eternal dinner scene continued, but now it was more like a tide than a loop, flowing in and out of different configurations while maintaining its essential purpose as an anchor point in the machinery of time. Claire's ritual space had transformed into something new as well. Instead of merely reflecting the cabin's eternal moment, it now served as a junction point, a place where different timelines could be monitored, guided, allowed to evolve without threatening the stability of reality itself. "We're not prisoners anymore," Thomas said, his form flickering briefly before restabilizing. "We're more like gardeners, tending the flows of time, maintaining the patterns while allowing for growth and change." Joel felt the truth of it in his new role. The empty chair wasn't empty anymore. It was occupied by possibility itself, by the potential for transformation that had always existed within the temporal machinery. And somewhere in the complex networks of time, Diana existed in all her versions, simultaneously finally understanding that freedom wasn't about breaking cycles, but about learning to flow within them, about finding ways to change without destroying, to evolve without collapsing. The sun rose fully over the mountains, its light refracting through layers of transformed reality. And in that light, Joel saw the true shape of what they had become. Not captives of eternal moments, but custodians of eternal possibility. Autumn had returned to the Adirondacks, painting the world in familiar colors. Joel adjusted his camera's settings as he had 1 year ago, but now he understood what he was really capturing. Not just light and shadow, but the subtle ways reality folded and unfolded around certain points in space and time. The cabin shifted between states as he approached, simultaneously present and absent, new and aged, eternal and evolving. Through its windows, the dinner scene continued its fluid cycle, but now the participants moved with conscious grace through their roles, maintaining crucial stability while allowing for constant change. "Some things can't be photographed," Margaret said, joining him at the cabin's threshold. "But that doesn't mean they can't be documented." She was right. Joel's latest exhibition, Temporal Watersheds, had caused a sensation in the art world. His photographs showed impossible overlaps, moments that couldn't exist simultaneously but somehow did. Critics called it revolutionary. Joel knew it was simply honest. Reality itself had changed, and his camera had adapted along with him. Claire's ritual space has fully transformed, Margaret continued, consulting notes that shifted subtly as she read them. "It's become a kind of temporal observatory, a place where we can monitor the flows, make sure the changes remain stable." Through the cabin's window, Joel watched his grandfather moving through the scene, his form more solid now that he no longer had to maintain the anchor point alone. Thomas caught his eye and nodded, photographer to photographer, guardian to guardian. The Sullivan family had found their own equilibrium in the new pattern. They existed in multiple states simultaneously, able to interact with linear time while maintaining their crucial role in reality's machinery. Sarah's laugh still echoed through the dinner scene, but now it carried joy rather than desperate determination. "Diana's journals are still appearing," Margaret said, showing him a leather-bound book whose pages contained writings from multiple versions of the same person. "But they're different now. Less bitter, more integrated." She opened to a recent entry, the handwriting showing the merged characteristics of Diana's various selves. "The chair remembers, but now it also dreams. Dreams of all the moments that could be, that have been, that are being. We're not prisoners of time anymore. We're its collaborators, its cultivators, its caregivers." Joel touched the empty chair, feeling the currents of possibility flowing through it. It wasn't truly empty anymore. It was occupied by potential itself, by the constant dance of what was and what could be. Claire appeared in the doorway, her form shifting slightly as she chose which moment to fully manifest in. "The protection spell has evolved," she said, her voice carrying echoes of decades of vigilance transformed into something new. "It doesn't just guard against change anymore, it guides it, shapes it, helps it flow in sustainable patterns." The frost that had coated the cabin's windows that first day now formed impossible crystalline structures that showed the true nature of time. Not a river flowing in one direction, but a complex watershed of possibility, maintained by conscious choice and constant care. Thomas joined them, camera in hand but lens cap firmly in place. "You've learned the lesson I took too long to understand," he told Joel. "Documentation isn't about capturing moments. It's about participating in them, understanding them, helping them evolve." Joel raised his own camera but not to take a picture. Through the viewfinder, he saw the layers of reality that now existed simultaneously. The original cabin, the eternal dinner, the transformed anchor point, all the possibilities flowing through this nexus of time and choice. Young Diana appeared, briefly, her form merging and separating from her other selves as she moved through the scene. "The pattern maintains itself now," she said, "but it still needs witnesses. Still needs people who can see the truth and help it grow." The dinner, scene reset, but this time Joel saw it for what it truly was. Not a prison or a loop, but a seed, a point from which new possibilities could grow, maintained by those who understood that some cycles didn't need to be broken, only transformed. Margaret made her final notes in a journal that existed in multiple versions simultaneously. The other anchor points have all evolved following this pattern. The temporal network is stable but no longer static. Change flows through it like water through a well-tended garden. Joel lowered his camera, understanding at last what his grandfather had tried to tell him from the beginning. Some things couldn't be documented, only experienced. Some truths couldn't be captured, only lived. But that didn't mean you stopped trying to share them. He turned to the cabin one final time, seeing it with both physical and temporal vision. The eternal dinner continued its fluid cycle, maintaining crucial stability while allowing for constant evolution. The empty chair waited, not for an occupant, but for the next transformation, the next possibility, the next choice that would help reality continue its delicate dance between stability and change. The first frost of autumn began to form on the cabin's windows, creating patterns that showed the true nature of time. Not a prison to escape or a cycle to break, but a garden to tend, a pattern to maintain, a story to keep telling in all its infinite variations. Joel Winters raised his camera one last time, not to capture the moment but to participate in it. And through his viewfinder he saw what he had become, not just a photographer, not just an anchor point, but a witness to the endless possibility that flowed through every moment, waiting to be seen, to be understood, to be transformed. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.